Chapter 3 of Baiting the Bears by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Phil Does Morris Rowland a Good Turn. It didn't take Phil long to get the run of the new duties in Mr. Lockwood's office. Toward the close of the second week, the banker called him into his private office and complimented him on the progress he had made. "I've examined your work myself, and I am thoroughly well pleased with it. It is my intention to put you in charge of our stock exchange work as soon as I find you have become familiar with the exchange methods." As a matter of course, Phil was delighted to know that his employer was so well pleased with his work. He had been a trifle nervous because of the coldness and unfriendly attitude of the head bookkeeper and his friend the cashier, but now he didn't care a rap for their opinion one way or the other. His P&Q stock had now reached 85, and he concluded to close out of the deal, and with his additional capital lay low for another chance at the market. Accordingly, when he went to lunch that day, he dropped in at the broker who did the trading for him and ordered the stock sold. Next morning he received a statement and a check for nearly $290, which looked like a lot of money to him at this stage of his career. He cashed the check and added it to the $10 he already had at the savings bank. "I'm doing pretty well," he mused, "for a beginner with no capital to speak about. One of these days I hope to become a big trader and make thousands where I now win dollars." A week later, Phil noticed a small item in a financial journal about a certain railroad which had successfully passed 2 dividends and had consequently run down and was selling way below its normal price. The article mentioned its improved prospects and the possibility that it would win its legal fight against the decision of the local authorities of one of the counties through which it had been trying to lay its tracks to make connection with a big trunk line. The writer thought the stock of this road, which was called the Central Ohio, was well worth investing in at its present low figure, as it was certain to rise sooner or later. Phil thought so too after he had done a little quiet investigating, and wished he had a good wad to put into it. But as he had only $300, he drew that out of the bank and invested it in 100 shares of Central Ohio at 30. He also induced Dick Ovens to buy 10 shares. "You'll find it'll be a winner, old chap, if you'll only hold on to it, and not sell out at first rise," he said to his chum. "But $30 represents my whole capital," replied Dick, "and I don't like to tie it up for an indefinite time, when perhaps I can do better by keeping it on the move at something else." "Yes, and lose it, most likely," laughed Phil. "Take my advice and stick to Central Ohio for a while. I shall, at any rate." "All right. I'll hold on to it till I see something I like better. How are you getting on at Lockwood's?" "Fine as silk." "That's good. I'll bet Rowland is sorry he bounced you." "What makes you think so?" "'Cause he's had no end of trouble with the rooster he hired to fill your shoes. The fellow is thicker than Jersey mud." "Well, I've got no further use for Rowland," said Phil with a snap of his eye. "He treated me without gloves, and he deserves to suffer for it." When Phil was going to lunch that day, he almost ran into the arms of Morris Rowland, who was coming out of the exchange. "Can't you see where you're walking?" snarled the broker, giving the boy a shove which sent him against the vendor of imitation images. The Italian was thrown off his balance, and the boardful of images he was bearing on his head was displaced, the plaster of Paris figures flying all around Rowland. One of them caught the broker on the nose, and immediately the blood gushed forth. "What is the matter? Why do you run into me?" exclaimed the Italian, shaking his fist at Phil. "See what you done? Break of the image, smash them all to pieces. You pay for them, or I call it a cop." "Pay nothing," retorted the boy, who had narrowly escaped himself from a crack on the head. "That man there pushed me against you. He's a broker. Make him settle up." At that point Rowland did a foolish thing. Holding his bleeding nose with one hand, he rushed at the Italian and knocked him into the gutter. "What do you mean, you measly scamp, by throwing your stuff all over me? I've got a great mind to have you pulled in." "Maledetto!" screamed the native of sunny Italy, springing to his feet. "I fix you. Cut your heart out." He whisked an ugly-looking knife from under his packet and lunged at the broker. Rowland saw the bright blade coming and turned as white as death. He had no time to avoid it, and would surely have received a nasty wound but for the presence of mind of Phil. The boy, with lightning-like rapidity, grabbed the Italian's wrists and stayed the blow within an inch of the broker's heart. Then he gave the foreigner's hand a quick wrench, and the glittering knife fell to the pavement in front of the gathering onlookers. "Cospetta, you broke my wrist!" cried the Italian. At that moment Rowland, furious with anger over his narrow escape, smashed the vendor in the face, and Phil had to interfere to save him from further punishment. "It's all your fault, confound you!" cried the broker, making a pass at Phil, forgetful of the fact that the boy had probably saved his life. Phil parried the blow, pushed the Italian through the fringe of spectators, and said to him, "Skip quick, or you'll be arrested for pulling that knife on the broker." As mad as the vendor was, he had sense enough to realize that he had better make himself scarce, and he flew across Broad Street and down the opposite side till he reached the corner of Beaver, when he disappeared. Phil himself also took advantage of this chance to walk off and entered a nearby lunchroom, leaving broker Rowland to explain matters to the policeman who came up a moment or two later. "Serves Rowland right," muttered the boy, mounting a stool and calling for a cup of coffee, a ham sandwich, and a piece of pie. "I wonder if he thinks he owns the sidewalk." When he got back to the office, Phil looked at the ticker and found there had been several sales that morning of Central Ohio, and the price had gone to 30 7/8. He had hardly got seated at his desk before Willie, the office boy, came up and said that Mr. Lockwood wanted to see him. Phil accordingly took himself into the banker's private office. "I want you to take this letter to Stone, Vomclaff and Company in Exchange Place. You will get a package of securities. Hand them to Mr. Reese when you return." "Very well, sir," answered Phil, who got his overcoat and hat and left the place. On the stairs he met and passed Eunuch coming up. Suddenly a handful of peanut shells came showering down on him. Turning quickly, the grinning countenance of the messenger told him to whom he was indebted for the trick. "What'd you do that for?" demanded Phil. "Oh, just for fun," retorted the sallow-faced youth. "I wouldn't do it again if I were you," replied Phil significantly as he passed on. "Oh," sneered the messenger, "you aren't so much." But Phil took no further notice of him. "I'd like to do something to that new clerk," muttered Enoch as he went on up the stairs. "He puts on a lot of airs for a fellow that was bounced from a job. I'd like to know why old Lockwood took him in. Huh, I hate him." The securities were delivered to Phil in a sealed package, and he duly handed them over to Mr. Reese in the same shape. When he returned to his desk, he found that his bottle of mucilage had been overturned in such a way that the sticky stuff had spread itself over a page of figures, stock quotations he had been preparing at Mr. Lockwood's request, to forward to a big operator with whom the house did business. "Do you know who did that?" he asked in a tone of intense annoyance to the nearest clerk. "No, couldn't say," replied the young fellow. "But Enoch came in this way a few minutes ago, and he stopped a moment near your desk. He might have accidentally upset the bottle." "I guess it wasn't an accident," said Phil angrily. He knew there wasn't any use of investigating the matter, for Enoch would be certain to deny that he was responsible for the damage. So he got a rag and wiped up the stuff, and then set to work to make a fresh copy. Before he was half done, Mr. Reese came up and wanted to know if he was ready to turn it in. "I had it nearly finished when I went out for Mr. Lockwood," he explained. "And when I got back, I found somebody had upset my pot of mucilage all over it, and so I had to recopy it." "I suppose you expect me to believe that story," said Reese unpleasantly. "Well, here's the evidence," answered Phil, taking the spoiled sheet from his wastebasket. "You are sure that you didn't do that yourself?" said the head bookkeeper in an ugly tone. "I am not accustomed to making false statements, sir," replied Phil quietly. "When will you have it completed?" "In half an hour." "See that you do, or I'll report you to Mr. Lockwood." He spoke loud enough for everyone in the counting room to hear, and Phil flushed to the roots of his hair. "He did that to humiliate me," muttered the boy as Reese walked away. At that moment he caught the eye of the stenographer fixed upon him with a look of sympathy, and he felt comforted. End of chapter 3.